Hi, welcome back to the studio for part two. Sorry it's taken me a while to get part two going. My wife's been out of town. She's been in New Mexico for a few weeks and she just got back the first of the week. And so we spent a day or a day and a half just kind of hanging out together and around the fire. And it got really cold here. I mean, it's colder than a witch's britches. Well digger's wither, nun's knickers. And last week it was so pretty. I was filming outdoor. I was filming a video for a Facebook jewelry group that I admin for, and it was so pretty. I went outdoors to film the little tutorial. But anyway, here we are back in the studio trying to stay warm. I've got a space heater going over there. I've been practically sitting on it all day. I don't know if I'm keeping it warm or if it's keeping me warm. But so what's happened since part one is I started to film part two. And of course, I realized after I'd started filming that my battery had gone dead. So you missed my soldering our bezel onto this piece of scrap. But that's as far as I've gotten, and you didn't miss much. I have soldered it onto some 18 gauge scrap and pickled it, and that's as far as we've gotten. I've decided that I want to make this project into a kind of a stair step, kind of a wedding cake ring, if you will. It'll be a split shank ring with another dimension that this part will sit on top of. So we'll have a two-tiered, really high, fancy ladies ring, and should be fun. So let's get going. All right, we're going to begin by sawing the excess out from around our bezel, and just applied a little bit of beeswax. I'm using a number 3 saw blade, by the way. And I've left myself a little bit extra here and there that I'll clean up with a file. I have a number 2 Swiss cut file here, and so I'm going to hit that real quick. All right, now that that is done, I need to kind of get an idea of the size and the shape of the second tier, or I guess the first tier of the bottom tier, we'll say, of the ring. So I'm thinking this will be the long part of an oval shape, about 26 millimeter by, say, maybe 22, 23 millimeter. So let's say it's 22 by 26. We'll add 22 and 30, or 22 and 26, and then divide that by 2 because we're looking for an average between the height and the width. And that's 24. Now we need to add about a millimeter. We're going to be using 18 gauge for the bezel of the bottom tier. So we'll add that in, that's 25, and then multiply that by 3.1415, which is pi. So we need our bezel for the bottom part to be 78.5, roughly 78.5 millimeters. Okay, so 78.5, I'm just going to mark that off with the calipers here. Hopefully this piece is long enough. Oh yeah. So I like this end better. It looks a little fresher. So I have my mark there. I'm going to saw it off and leave it just a little bit long. Now I'm just eyeballing that because I'm going to freshen up the ends with a file. Isn't that a lovely sound? Like fingernails on the chalkboard. Okay, now we are making progress. All right, it's time to break out our bez jaws. And again, the way the bez jaws work is we just pry them open until they fit the bezel material up to about 10 millimeters, as wide as I've designed these to work. And once it snaps in place, then you can slide it down the bez jaws. Just popped it out there. Okay, there we go. And now we're ready to get started. What I'd like to do, since this is about making a serrated bezel, I'm going to take the opportunity to do it twice. We did it on the first bezel, and then I'm going to saw about halfway through the 18 gauge bezel material. All right, we're set up now. For this part of the project, we're going to use the bez jaws, and we'll be holding the bezel material on its side, and we won't be working on the top of the bezel at all. When you use the bez jaws, you don't need to tighten down with a lot of force. All you're doing is trying to secure the bezel material from slipping, sliding, popping out. We'll also be using the serrated bezel indexing tool. Also, you know, I decided to call this the serrated bezel indexing tool because most people think of serration when they think of those lines. Unless they've been to jewelry school, they're going to call that serration rather than castellated. But whichever you prefer is okay with me. It's not my child, it's my tool. So I'm going to place the bezel indexing tool on the very end of the material. And also, before I get started, I'm going to put a black mark with a Sharpie on one end, on the end that I start with. That way, if I take it out to examine it, I won't run the risk of turning it around the wrong way and messing myself up. So that's just a good practice that I've had to learn the hard way. And that looks to be about all that I need is about that many strokes. That's what we have thus far. Perfectly spaced serrations or castellations across the face of the bezel material. All right, now I'm going to use a pair of flat half-round pliers. They're half-round on one side and they're flat on the other side to form the bezel into a circle. And again, I'm not going to be worried about forming it into the perfect 22 by 26 millimeter oval that I'm shooting for. All I want to do is get the ends moved together and aligned perfectly so that I can solder them together. And again, you really want to take your time when you're bringing the two ends of your bezels together, whether you're doing a serrated bezel or not, because it makes soldering so much easier if you have a really, really perfect fit. That's the last place you want to get in a hurry. And that looks like a perfect fit. So I'm going to exchange my vise for my soldering station. All right, I'm set up in the third hand to solder. I'm going to use hard solder again. Try to use hard solder whenever possible. And always on my first soldering operations or independent soldering operations. We'll begin by putting a little bit of liquid flux on the bezel, both top and bottom at the join. And I'm going to pick solder this time. So a little bit of flux is on my pick, and I'll just heat up the piece of hard solder until it balls and sticks to the end of the pick. This is a tungsten pick. And the solder is beginning to flow and has flowed. So we'll drop the bezel into the pickle for just a moment. Okay, I've pulled the piece out of the pickle and dried it off. Get an idea of what we're working with. Now I'm going to put it on a ring mandrel and round it up using a mallet. And the reason that I'm rounding it up is it'll just give me a uniform shape to begin with before I turn it into an oval. I find it's a lot easier to work backwards from one uniform shape to another. So now we have our ring. That's actually about my size, but it's not going to be for long. There's a lot of ways you could do this. You could take a set of round rounding pliers like this and pull backwards, and that might give us the ability to do what we want with more ease. I think I liked what we were working with better before. So I'm going to get my I get another pair of flat round or half round pliers and straighten that out just a little bit where I over bent it. Somebody's pulling my chain. And then I'm going to flatten out a high spot here. That's beginning to look like I would like. I'm just going to test fit, make sure that I haven't made it too narrow or too tall. It looks fairly uniform all the way around the circumference of the stone. So I'm going to go with that. Now I'll use my bezel to mark out a couple of pieces of silver. I'm going to have a top piece and of course a bottom piece, and I'll probably make this 16 gauge, and I'll need to just get those cut out, and I'll hallmark the bottom of the ring, the part that'll go against the finger. I'll hallmark that, and I'll put my maker's mark on it as well before I get both pieces put on. Otherwise it'll be impossible to do that. So let's move on to sawing that out and getting it attached. I'll blaze right through that because you've seen me do that kind of work already in this project. I'm going to roughly place my solder where I kind of have evenly distributed it. And then I think I'll use a little Cuprinil. This is really handy to be able to just spray your solder or spray your flux where you want it. And then use your solder pick to place your solder exactly where you want it. That looks good to me. After you're finished soldering on a block like this, you should move the piece a couple of times as it's cooling so the flux doesn't end up glassing, and if there's any flux on the bottom, it doesn't end up sticking to the block. Your blocks will last a lot longer if you don't allow your piece to stick to them. Just about finished filing around the perimeter, and I'm leaving it a lip, just a fraction of a millimeter, to again match the stone's bezel. Hopefully this will complement the way that we've done the bezel on the stone. To be honest, I have never done one exactly like this, so I hope it turns out nice. But sometimes trying things new is a gamble. Okay, I think I'm happy with this. Now we'll need to hallmark it and put the maker's mark on. Let's move over to the metal forming bench to do that. Okay, here we are at the forming bench. This is where we do all the stamping, dapping, and use the disc cutter and what have you. Also have a small rolling mill and a couple of small anvils. And I share this bench with my wife. She stamps jewelry, stamps charms, and she makes coin rings and what have you. So this is kind of a common bench that we both use. Anyway, what I'd like to do now is to hallmark this first tier, and in order to do that I made a a step, a standoff that I could put inside so I won't damage the wall here. Let me back up and get a better shot of this. Now I'll need to make the top of this foundation for the ring, and to do that I'm just going to roughly scribe around the oval, and then I'm going to go over to the shears and cut that off. A bit proud of my scribe line. Okay, I've just roughly trimmed this with the shears, and I stayed outside my scribed line. Now I'll punch a hole in it with a disc cutter, and that will allow me to solder it on without having any worries about if I have to have an explosion later on when I'm soldering the top piece on. That'll make more sense in a minute. But if this has a hole in it, then hot gases can escape as I solder. It's really not a problem to solder this to this. If that were the last soldering job, I wouldn't really have a concern. But that's not the last soldering job. I still have to solder the top bezel on, and then I have to solder the shank of the ring on as well. So I don't want there to be a chamber that traps gas. Okay, what I have here is a small potter press. This is a 20-ton bottle press, or bottle jack press that Potter USA sells, and it gets a lot of use here. I'm going to be using this little disc cutter. I think this is a Pepe, or I'm not sure what it is, but a disc cutter is a disc cutter. So somehow in the 8 short steps between there and here, I managed to lose the piece that I had just made. So I ended up having to make another one. I've literally been searching for the last 30 minutes or so. Of course, the first one looked much better than this one, as is typical. Anyway, that's shop life, I guess. I'm gonna clean this up with a little bit of acetone and some denim. I find if I take just an extra minute or so to clean my metal surfaces before soldering, I get a much better result. Ah, wow. Okay, well, I just found my original piece. I should have turned the camera on sooner, and I'm going to use it. It looks better. I can't tell you how many times a day that kind of stuff happens to me.